Yes. I'm laughing because you have no idea how many times I am halfway through a meeting or something and I said, oh, I forgot to do that. So this time, thank you all. Carol, did we get you? Did you have a No, you're brand new.
I'm brand new. I am a member of Somerset County, Somerset Hundred, and now National Organization for Women, which we are trying to do some more liaison work with League of Women Voters, and obviously young voters is an important part of that. And I'm also a historical storyteller specializing in women's stories, telling their stories.
Want the light on behind you? No, probably not.
No. That's very interesting.
You want the plate somewhere more handy? Yes. Here.
Okay. All right. I know that there is a way for me to mute everybody when we get going, but I would really like to have a conversation as much as possible. When I start teaching the lesson, I will put you on mute or ask you to mute yourself until it's important that you speak. There may also be more people coming in. As I said, we had 22 people register, some of them like right now at the last minute. I think JJ's in. Okay. So there may be times when I will have to stop and click the button and so forth. I hope that you'll just be tolerant of me. What we're doing tonight, there are a couple of things that we're going to be doing. I'm going to go through and actually let you experience part of Fighting for the Vote, the timeline of suffrage, most of it. I'm going to be giving you some tips about how we teach it, both remotely as well as in person. And at this point in time, most of the presentations that I personally am making are in person. But during COVID, everything was done remotely. So we know that they work both ways. The other thing I'm going to do is show you exactly where you can get everything that we're talking about so that you don't feel like you're being set adrift or anything like that. You've got the tools that you need to be able to start working with this stuff and use it yourselves. And I am always available to you for questions, for support. I'll even come in and work with you, co-present with you the first time if you're nervous about doing that and you live somewhat locally. I am more than happy to do a hybrid presentation for those of you who are on the West Coast. And that has worked well when I've used, I've used student co-presenters and they're in school and they can't get out to go with me, but they have a study hall or something like that. And so they work with me. So that's what we're going to do tonight. Very briefly, Energizing Young Voters is just barely 4 years old. It started with one lesson, the timeline of suffrage, which is what we're going to be starting with tonight. And it has expanded to what it is today, a suite of programs that reflect the two goals that the League has, empowering voters and defending democracy. We take our nonpartisanship very seriously, and we also feel very strongly that it is not our job to tell students what issues they should care about, nor how they should go about resolving the issues that they care about. Instead, it's our job to teach kids how to make good decisions for themselves. So rather than taking what appear to be sometimes partisan stands on issues, we say that we're issue agnostic. And we ask that if you use these lessons, that you remain issue agnostic as well. It's really important from my point of view, for us to get into schools and have the schools feel confident that we are not going to be trying to sway their students one way or another. And I will tell you, it's not easy. So what I very often do at the beginning of a class or a lesson is to say to the teacher and to the students, if they're old enough, sometimes I don't say it with the middle school, but I ask the teacher, please, if there is anything that sounds as if it is partisan in any way, shape, or form, let me know. Because what we will try to do then is to take a hard look at it, decide why it seems to be that way, decide whether or not we need to make any adjustments, and then make those adjustments if needed. I'll give you a very practical example. In the lesson that we teach, where in the Fighting for Change series, One of them has kids identify issues, and we have a slide where issues pop up. And one of those issues was gun control.
Mhm.
And one of the students said to me, "I'm sorry, that's got to go." And I said, "It does? Why?" You know? And he said, "Because to me, that should say gun rights." I went, oh, yes. So he and I talked, and I said, it's an issue, and it's an issue on both sides. So what should we put up there? And he said, guns. That's fine. I said, fine. So we changed the slide right then and there. And it was a good lesson for me, and it was a good lesson for the kids and for the teacher to see that we are that flexible. And I mean, that was a clear and easy example. Some of them are a little more fuzzy. We
Yeah.
also ask people to go through our website. And deliberately, I choose people that I know are very left-leaning and people that are very right-leaning, and ask them to look at it for me and tell me if anything pops up. At this point, most of the time it doesn't, but initially it did. So the other thing I will tell you ahead of time is that we make adaptations in all of the lessons. Particularly around elections, there are a couple of our lessons that are specific to an election time. For example, in New Jersey, our gubernatorial election is not at the same time as any other kind of election. So we're kind of like an off year. We have lessons designed for that particular election. We also we have a student advocate toolkit that can be used in any election. And we have one person in the league who is designated to go through that and change everything and bring it up to date each time there's a new election coming up. So you can depend on the fact that the stuff is current and it is accurate. The only thing that we ask you when you use our lessons is that you respect our intellectual rights and you take credit for the things that you do yourself. This is an adopt and an adapt program. Different contexts require different strategies and sometimes actually different materials. So you are welcome to make changes in any of the things that we have. You can take things from 3 different lessons and put them together into one of your own. If you add anything to it, give yourself credit for that, but let us know that you've done it. And because we'd like to see, somebody else might be able to use it too. I will urge you to be very careful about any images that you put into any slides that you create for yourself because of copyright issues. You have to make sure that there is nothing that requires payment or licensing. The league has an entire, it's a huge number of images that are free for us to use. So that's a good source first. You can go to the national website for that information. The other thing you can do if you use Google Images is to use their tools and just pick the images that belong to Creative Commons licenses, because those are all free to use. So just those are some cautions. Okay, so I sent to you what you would get if you were the teacher in a classroom and what you would give to a teacher if you were teaching this lesson remotely. It was a list of avatars and a place where teachers could fill in the names. In fact, let me share it because I think I can do that pretty quickly and easily. You got something that looked like this. The teacher would get a list with the avatars' names on the right. And this happens to be for a class of 20 to 25. When I show you the website, you'll see that there are lists for classes of 15, classes of 30, so that you don't have to, make this up on your own. Then the teacher puts in the names of all of the people who are in the class, so that in this case, let's see, Judith, you are going to be Jason. The other thing that the teachers get is a copy of the slideshow, and the slideshows too are set up with different numbers of people. So if you looked at your name, let's see, I'm going to put myself in the first. So let's say I'm George Washington. I go to George and I have to see what his characteristics are. So he's a white man, 64 years old, he owns property, and he's a citizen. Now, when I teach in the classroom, the avatars are available on the website. And what I did was to ask Staples to print them on 3x5 cards and then laminate them, because I use them a lot. And the lamination keeps them clean. And during COVID, you know, I could take a wipe and I could clean them off after each use of the class. I do this with the excuses cards for the next lesson that we're going to do as well. And then I just reuse them. It's very easy. There is a way of organizing. I'm going to show, actually, what I'm going to do is to go right to our website. All right, so you want to teach fighting for the vote. You go to our website and you go to the Educators and Community Groups page. When you get there, you can scroll down and you see all of the lessons that we offer. We're going to use the timeline of suffrage first. And when you click on the little plus sign, you get a short description, and then it says view module. And what that takes you to are folders that are in the cloud. The first folder here is the avatars folder. There's the slideshow that I just showed you. And here is the set of directions for the game. So this tells you that there are percentages of the population that fall into each one of the voting categories. So when you distribute the cards, they have to match that. So 10% of the class should be white male. The first one's white male, like I am. 10% should be property owners and all of those same characteristics. And then there's a percentage for Black men, and then a percentage for women, and then a percentage for 18-year-olds, and so on. So to make it easy, if you have a class of 10, there's the 10 avatars that you should give out. If you have a class of 15, there they are. There's the class of 20, and there's a class of 30. Now, if you have a class that's, say, 28 kids, I would use the class of 30, and I'd take out 2 women, just because when people stand up or when they turn their screens on and off, and I'll explain the difference between those two, there is still a huge impact when the population suddenly doubles, the voting population doubles. You are smart enough to be able to make adjustments yourself, but try to remember that you want to try to keep the percentage of the population as close as possible to what is right up at the beginning here. Okay, any questions about that before I jump ahead and show you what the game is like? If you have questions, you can just unmute yourself and ask them. Okay.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, it took me a minute to unmute. Can you pull that slide one more time?
Sure.
I don't see female at all.
It is the
50%
here, the D.
Is just 21%, 21 years and up, but it doesn't say gender.
It should be female there. Thank you.
And then the 10%, 18 years and up, must be just 18 through 20, right? Because it's only 10% in that category.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
You got it. Thank you. Nobody ever pointed that out to me before. I appreciate that. Okay, so back to the website. As I said, when you click on module, it also brings up the slideshow and the script. There is one of these for each one of the lessons that we have. So you'll have the slides that you and I will go through tonight, as the teacher, you also have word by word, if you want, what you need to say. It's been researched, it's accurate. So especially in the fighting for the vote timeline of suffrage, I would suggest you stick as closely as possible to this script. We had somebody one time who went off on a tangent and started talking about her grandfather fighting in World War II. That doesn't work. The script, the way it's written, does work. And so in order to stay sure that you're accurate and to keep the kids' attention, I would urge you to stay with this. I would also really encourage you, if you read the script, to read it as if you're reading a really interesting story to a group of kids. Because if you can be somewhat dramatic, you'll be surprised at how much. I mean, it's like they're 10 years old again, you know, or 8 years old, and they're sitting in your lap waiting to hear what the next words are. Drama is good. Also, be careful about the speed with which you speak, because people need to process the information that's going into their heads. So with those two things, any questions about where you can find them, how you find them? Website, hit the plus sign here. There's the module, and everything you need is available. I mentioned that it can be taught both remotely and in person. It started as an in-person presentation, and then came COVID, and we had to change everything that we were doing, which was quite a challenge. We had a whole group of teachers sit down with us and say, all right, how do we make this work? And then we offered it to teachers as something that, so they didn't have to, you know, put themselves on the line every single minute of the day. Sometimes it was just like an extra, and sometimes it actually fit into the curriculum. But no matter which way, it was worthwhile for the kids. Okay, so here we are. I first introduced myself as a member of the League of Women Voters. It's an organization over 100 years old, and it was formed in order to support those people who were fighting for suffrage for women. This slide is hidden when you show it yourself, but it is the intellectual property slide. All right, so let's take a look. We're going to talk about the suffrage timeline. Does anyone in the class know what the word suffrage means? And don't be embarrassed if you don't, because there are adult groups that we ask and they don't know what it means. But let's take a shot at it. Does anyone here know what it means? And most of the time, now the teacher side of me is talking, most of the time somebody will say it means something like suffering. And then we bridge to, it does sound like that. It's not even from the same root word, but what is important to know is that many, many people suffered, and some people even died in order to earn the right to vote. So in New Jersey, who can vote now? And we ask the kids to give us that information. And most of the time they know that you have to be a citizen and 18 years old or older. They don't know in New Jersey that you don't have to be, that as long as you're not in prison on a felony, that you can vote in New Jersey. That's a new law for you people in Washington. Up until 2 years ago on St. Patrick's Day, people couldn't vote again. Now, or they couldn't vote while they were on parole or probation. Once they leave the prison at this point in time, once they return as citizens into the state, they can now re-register and vote again in New Jersey. So we point out that that's a new thing. Those of you in Washington, you obviously want to check what the law is, and if there's anything specific that you think the kids should know, fit it into this slide. There is a link here to a video that one of our students made. I'm not going to play it for you now for the sake of time, but I would urge you to go back and look at it. There is one incorrect fact in it, but the fact that kids were interested enough to take the story and to make videos themselves, I think is impressive. Shail did it about what voting was in the state of New Jersey, and it's really intriguing. Those of you in New Jersey really should look at it. And he's right, except, as I said, for one thing. Okay, back to me. All right, as the teacher in the classroom, you've got your avatar cards. So we're going to pretend that we're in person right now. Take a look at your avatar card and see what the characteristics of your avatar are. I'm going to ask a couple of people in the classroom to tell me who they are, to tell me what the characteristics are, just to make sure that they've got the concept. When we work remotely, we've given everybody avatar cards, and this, if we had a class of 25, this would be the spread of the people who were in the class, according to those percentages. Okay. Okay. All right. We do want to recognize that there were people living on this land, and in this region, it was the Lenni Lenape, long before the original colonies were established. But for our story, we are going to start with the Revolutionary War, because that set the stage for the formal establishment of our government as we know it today. Americans have been fighting for the vote from the very beginning of our nation. We fought a war with England, the Revolutionary War, for our independence. But another way to look at that Revolutionary War is to think about it as a war for the right to vote. The colonists who were here were really upset because, among other things, they had no voice. They had no way to influence the fact that they were being taxed by a parliament that was across the ocean in England. Remember the famous protest, no taxation without representation? And you probably also heard the story about the Boston Tea Party, where the colonists were so upset that because they liked tea so much, that they actually went and boarded a ship and threw the tea into the harbor because they refused to pay the tax on it, because they had no voice in saying what that tax should be. In the Revolutionary War, this war for the right to vote, nearly 17,000 colonists died, and between 8,000 and 12,000 more were taken prisoner. And you know what happens when people are taken prisoner of war, especially back then when there wasn't good medical care. Thousands of those prisoners also died of disease. Oops. I am one slide ahead. So this is what it should have looked like when I was saying all of that. Okay, so having won the war, the leaders of the new nation met and they argued, and believe me, they argued, and they finally agreed on a set of rules under which the government would operate, the new government. They set these rules down, and they're called the U.S. Constitution. Now, obviously, if you're talking to older groups, you wouldn't be saying it like they're called the Constitution. They would know that. Many of the leaders in this new nation were upset because they had just gotten rid of King George III. So they knew they didn't want a strong central government, and they couldn't figure out quite what the arrangement would be. So they finally split some of the things that they thought should belong to the states, and they gave rights to the states, and they kept some things at the federal level, but not too many. One of those things that they gave to the states, and you're going to hear this over and over again, was that the states could make the decision about who could vote. The founders decided not to define voting requirements at the federal level. They gave that responsibility totally to the states. So it's 1788. It's the first US election. Who can vote? Now, I am going to stop sharing my screen, which is what we would do if we were teaching this remotely. And I'm going to ask any of you who are white, male, 21 years old or older, and who own property to leave your screen on. But I'm going to ask the rest of you to turn your screen off.
Just a clarification, we're talking about our avatar, not our own.
That's correct. Yes, that's correct. Thank you for that. So if unless you are a white man, 21 years old or older, your screen should be off. Who owns property? Diane?
And did everybody get an avatar? That's the other question here, right? Some people might, it looks like Judy didn't, for instance.
Let's see here. All right, I'm going to go back to that later, but yes, you did, and I can't remember who it is. So, so at this point in time, I'm going to ask the three of you to turn your screens off because I want you to see what happens in that 10% thing. The lower left-hand corner, just click on your screen. Okay. All right. At any rate, what would happen is with a group our size is that there would be one person remaining, and that would be me because I was George Washington. So you can, it is such an impressive thing when people start to turn their screen off and you see that nobody is really, only one person is making the decision for everyone else that was in the room. Okay, you can all turn your screens back on again now. And I will show you what it looks like back with that class of 25. If you had a class of 25 people, these are the people that would be remaining. And you can see how few people are actually making the decision. Now, in person, those two kids who have those, I say to them, well, how are you feeling right now? You know, and most of them will say, I'm feeling pretty good. I have the power, you know, that kind of thing. And it's, you know, we kind of joke around with it. And the rest of them, how are you feeling? Well, I don't like it. Those guys are making the decisions for me. Okay, fine. Then we move on.
Can't figure out how to make myself come back in.
The lower left-hand corner, there should be an image of a camera. Do you see that?
Ah, yeah, got it.
Okay. All right, so that should get you in there. Okay. So we're going to move ahead about 60 years or so to 1856. At this point in time, the country has expanded west quite far, and it has grown from 13 states all the way up to 32 states. And the population has grown as well. It used to be 4 million back in 1790 when that first election had taken place. And now it was 23 million people. So because of all of that change, customs were changing as well. And one of the things that people stopped paying quite so much attention to was who owned property and how much property and what kind of social position they have and that sort of thing. There were men who had fought in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 who, because they didn't own property, had no right to vote. So what they needed to do, because remember, the states make the decisions about voting, they needed state by state by state to go and convince that state that even though they didn't have property, they should have the right to vote because they had fought in wars and they were men and they were, doing their citizens' duty and so on. So finally, in 1856, the last state, which was North Carolina, granted men, white men who were 21 years of age or older, the right to vote, whether or not they had property. So at this point in time, which one do we need to cross off? You can just, if somebody's unmuted, they can say it. The kids would say, cross off property owner. So then you'll look at your avatar cards, and I'm not going to ask you to turn your screen off and on again because I've got those slides, which are also available to you if you're talking to somebody about this program. And at this point in time, there would be 6 people out of the 25 or 5 people out of the 25 who would actually have the right to vote. So again, you say, oh, well, how do you new people feel about having the right to vote? Yay, we're good, And then I say to those first 2 people, well, how do you feel? What has happened to your power because these new people have the right to vote? And they realize, oh, my power's just been cut in half. That's not too good. And you ask a couple of people who still are hidden, how are you feeling? Well, I'm not liking this at all because it's only white guys, or it's only men, period, or something like that. So we get them involved in the chat or in the conversation. All right, so let's move on. We're going to move on to the next milestone in the timeline of suffrage. The right to vote was not mentioned in the Constitution. And it wasn't until the end of the Civil War that the Constitution was actually amended, which means changed, in order to set the first nationwide rules about suffrage. And here's what happened. About the same time that those states were eliminating property ownership as a voting requirement, the country was facing a huge challenge, probably the biggest challenge in its history. And it was one that would have a profound effect on suffrage. In the mid-1800s, the North and the South had their tension was just mounting between those 2 regions because of the idea of slavery. That was one of the things that had been left to the states as well. There was a mounting question as new states were added to the Union. Whoops. Sorry about that. I leaned my booklet on the keyboard. Okay. All right, so the new states had to answer the question, were they going to be slave states or were they going to be free states? The election of Abraham Lincoln brought those tensions to a head. The South withdrew from the Union and hostilities began. Between 1861 and 1865, America waged the bloodiest war in its history. The war was fought over slavery and the rights of African or Black Americans. But in the end, once again, it was also about suffrage. The North won the war, and the Union was saved, and slavery was ended, and African American men were given the right to vote. But the country paid an enormous price in blood for this right to vote. Between 650,000 and 850,000 Americans died as a result of the Civil War. That's more than any war we have ever fought. 620,000 Americans equaled 2% of the population of the nation at that time. That would be the equivalent of losing more than 6 million Americans today. 1 out of every 4 soldiers who went to war did not come home. Freeing nearly 4 million formerly enslaved people left really important questions that our country faced. What rights did those newly freed African Americans have? And were formerly enslaved people citizens? And if they were citizens, could they actually vote? Well, it took 3 different constitutional amendments to answer those questions. In 1865, at the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution passed, and it ended slavery. In 1868, another amendment, the 14th Amendment, made all people born in the US, and that included the formerly enslaved, into American citizens. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution provides that with few discrete exceptions, people born in the US are citizens of this country, irrespective of race, ethnicity, or the national origin of their parents. And that's the first time the word citizen is used, by the way, in the Constitution. Prior to that, it was just assumed that it was the wealthy who had been here forever. But at any rate, then in 1870, the 15th Amendment changed the suffrage laws across the entire country. It gave African American citizens the right to vote. The 15th Amendment states that the rights of citizens to vote shall not be denied by the United States, and here's the key phrase, or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This is the very first time that the federal government steps in to make laws that govern the entire country around voting.
But Pat,
Yes.
wasn't that only for men?
Uh-huh.
So it's not just all blacks, it's black men.
Black men, yes. And that's when this comes in. So which one do we cross off now?
White.
Right.
White.
Right. Okay, so now we make them look at their avatar cards again. And if they are citizens, male, 21 or older, now you can vote. Now, in schools, when we're in person, I do one of 2 things. I ask kids to stand behind their chairs and then to sit down again. So initially you have 2 people standing up and then they sit down. Second one, you have 4 people or 5 people standing up and then they sit down. And now you have 9 people standing up. And again, you can ask them, all right, so now those of you who were standing before, your power has been diminished because now there are more people making decisions. And you may not like those people who are making the decisions for you. And then how do those of you who are still sitting down, and most of the people who are still hidden are women. And so you say to them, why can't you vote? And they'll say, because I'm a woman. Why can't you vote? I'm not yet a citizen. Why can't you vote? I'm 16. Why can't you vote? I'm a woman. Why can't you vote? I'm a woman. I'm a woman. I'm a woman. And so it gets very repetitive, which sets the stage for the next module, for the next. There we go. All right, so we've now moved up and it is 1920. Now, again, there is a link here, but this time I'm going to play it. This is also one of our young board members who took it on herself. She said, this shouldn't be an old white lady who's reading this. It should be somebody like the rest of us. And so she created this.
We're not hearing anything, Pat.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for telling me that. I'm going to go back to the beginning and I'm going to stop sharing because I always do this. And I'll tell you what you need to do is to make sure when you're ready to share, there are two small boxes in the lower left-hand corner of the pop-up screen. One says share sound and the other one says optimize for video clip. Those two need to be checked so that the people on the other side can hear it. So let me go back and start it again.
It is now 1920. It has been over 130 years since all white male citizens were given the right to vote. It's been more than 50 years since the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote, but women still have no constitutional right to vote. Many women had learned that they could make their voices heard during the struggles to abolish slavery and reduce alcohol consumption. They discovered that they could speak in public and influence political decisions. They decided to try to gain the right for women to vote. They marched, gave speeches, and lobbied politicians. These women were called suffragists because they were fighting for their suffrage. Susan B. Anthony was one of the most famous suffragists. By the early 1900s, a new generation of women took up the fight. They wanted a constitutional amendment to say that states could not deny the citizens the right to vote based on sex. These women suffragists were unstoppable. They marched, they sued, they lobbied, they picketed outside the White House for more than a year through rain, cold, and blizzards. They were harassed, even by other women, many of whom did not want the vote. When President Woodrow Wilson lost his patience with their picketing, they were arrested. Some suffragists were arrested. They could have paid a small fine to be set free, but they chose to go to jail. They wanted their stories to be told. Some of the jailed suffragists refused to eat. They went on hunger strikes. They wanted people to know that they were willing to die to get the vote. The women on hunger strikes got thinner and thinner and weaker. They needed help to walk. Their pictures were in the paper, and President Woodrow Wilson, who refused to support a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage, was worried a suffragist might die. To make sure they didn't die, the starving suffragists were force-fed. They were strapped down, a rubber hose was pushed down their throat to their stomach, and liquid food was poured through the hose. Finally, after all these struggles, President Wilson gave in. He agreed to support the suffrage amendment, and the women were released from jail. The 19th Amendment, guaranteeing the woman the right to vote, was ratified and made into the law of the land in August 1920. However, let's remember that women of color would still have to fight for their vote long after the women's suffrage movement was over.
All right, so I don't know if you're as impressed with her as I am, but she is a high school junior this year. She was a sophomore when she made that for us. And that's the kind of impact that the program had on a young person in one of the classes that we presented. All right, so it's 1920. Which one do we need to cross off? Of course, it's going to be male. And then we say, but it's complicated. This is what it would look like when all of the people would be standing, be a very small group that would not have the right to vote. However, what happens is that didn't work. What's supposed to happen here is that those images begin to disappear. But there is more to the story. Once the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, the work of Black women was not yet done. While legally they had the right to vote, in reality they couldn't. Black women had to continue their fight for full voting rights all the way to 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act that prohibited racial discrimination in voting. Millions of people, men and women alike, were still excluded from the vote, as many barriers to suffrage remained. There are setbacks and breakthroughs that we need to talk about still. Despite the trend toward greater suffrage throughout our history, there has been powerful resistance to allowing certain groups to cast their votes, even when the law gave them that right. So even though we've worked through major milestones, we have a long way to go. And what I would do in the class when all of these people are standing, I would say to them, all right, I'm afraid that I'm going to have to ask a few of you to sit back down. So if you happen to be Black or Black man or a Black woman, would you please sit down? If you happen to be Asian, would you please sit down? If you happen to be Latinx, would you please sit down? If you happen to be Indigenous, would you please sit down? And what happens is that you begin to see that whole screen go back to being only about 7 or 8 people making the decisions for everyone else that's in the room. And at that point in time, I usually ask the kids to sit and talk with the other people at their table or close to them. Like, how did that make you feel when you saw all those people sitting down? And once the discussion is over, oh, here we go. This is what it looks like. So every time there's been progress, there is also pushback. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next few slides. And then I'm going to stop this, even though there's more to it, because I want you to have a chance to talk about it and to ask questions. So the struggle faced by Black women, Amira Davis is another one of our young women. And she had a poor internet connection when she was recording this, but I think you can understand what she is saying during that one blip. I want to let her tell her part of the story.
The 19th Amendment promised women that their right to vote would not be denied on the basis of sex. Yet, even after that milestone, millions of people, women and men alike, were still excluded from the right to vote. As many barriers, suffrage remained. The fight over the amendment was not just about sex. It was also deeply entwined with race. While the women's suffrage movement had its roots in the anti-slavery movement, early suffragist leaders, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, later split off from their alliance with abolitionists. They were angry that under the 15th Amendment, Black men would get the vote while white women were still denied. Decades later, when the 19th Amendment was up for debate, Southern politicians especially seethed over the prospect of enfranchising millions of African American just as men enfranchised men, law if not by practice. The women suffragists faced a moral dilemma. Racist opposition in Congress could have led to the defeat of suffrage for any woman, while suffragists turned their backs on the Black women who had also long fought for their right to vote. While technically Black women had the right to vote, whites in the Jim Crow South knew all too well how to keep African Americans from voting. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, violence, and lynching. They long kept Black men from the polls, and now they were going to keep Black women from the polls as well. Of the 19th Amendment marked for African American women to start, not to finish. It fueled a new chapter in the struggle for voting rights in the United States, a movement that Black women led all the way to 1965 and passage of the Voting Rights Acts.
All right, the next few slides I'm going to read through as well, because many of the things in these slides you may already know, but I did not until we started looking hard at the fact that our slideshow was very white when we began it. So these are some of the new things that we've added. Also excluded from the franchise were Native Americans, many of whom were not even U.S. citizens, were not allowed to become U.S. citizens until 1924. Native Americans in some states were considered wards of the state, Foster children are another group who were considered wards of the state. And they weren't guaranteed the right to vote until passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Voting rights activist Gertrude Simmons Bonin, Zitkala Sa of the Yankton Sioux tribe, was prominent in the women's suffrage movement for their community. She and other Native suffragists didn't want only to have U.S. citizenship. They also wanted recognition of their citizenship in tribal nations and their treaty rights, particularly to land. They wanted to use U.S. suffrage and U.S. citizenship to save their land and their communities. After the 19th Amendment was ratified, Bonin spent the next several years going to white women and saying, "Now you have the vote. Please fight for my people. Don't forget your Indian sisters." Asian American immigrants as well were long ineligible for naturalized citizenship on account of race. Remember, we brought all those Chinese men in order to build the railroad, but then once the railroad was done, we were also done with them. They only won the vote starting in 1943. Among those who advocated for both women's suffrage and immigrant rights was a young woman named Mabel Pinghua Lee. As a teenager, no older than many of the students in this class, Lee became a powerful voice in the suffrage movement. People talked about her speeches and about how the audience was Mabelized by her ability. White suffragists thought she was so phenomenal, so much so that they asked the 16-year-old Lee to march on horseback at the front of a major suffrage parade in New York City in 1912, before the suffrage amendment was passed. It would take more than 20 years after the 19th Amendment's ratification for Lee and other Chinese American immigrants to become eligible for citizenship and thus eligible for the right to vote. It was not until 1943 that Chinese immigrants could even begin naturalizing as U.S. citizens. Truly broad access to American citizenship and voting rights was not available to Asians and Asian Americans until the Immigration and Nationality Acts of 1952 and then the Civil Rights Act of 1965 that removed race as a barrier to immigration and citizenship. All right. And then there's a section that goes through the fight for rights and then the Voting Rights Act that I'm going to skip right there. And at 65, now we can let all of those people who had to sit down before, they can all stand back up again. And then we go through the 19th Amendment, how it was also connected with a war, the Vietnam War, but it was different. And it was different because the men that we sent to Vietnam, out of the men that we sent to Vietnam, about half of the people who were killed were between 18 and 21 years of age. And they had no right to say anything about the war, in which they were very likely to not come home again. That was the fastest amendment that was ever passed in our Constitution, in our country. It only took 2 years. And the big slogan that got that movement, got that amendment moved was old enough to fight, old enough to vote. So now we can make it 18, and then those kids stand up. But there's more. Page. The story's almost over. Almost. There were still people of color who were being denied the right to vote. The 1965 Voting Rights Act allowed Puerto Rican citizens to vote using their Spanish language. But mainland Latinas and Latinos were still denied. When they went to vote, they were given a literacy test, literally a literacy test. They were given something to read, and they were asked, if you can read this, you can vote. But if you can't, well, I'm sorry, you can't vote. So this inability to read and write English, as well as things like violence and gerrymandering and intimidation, were still being used by states, particularly in the Southwest, to deny Latinos the right to vote. In 1974, the Southwest Voter Registration and Education Project, which was the first and largest nonpartisan Latino voter registration participation in the U.S., started operations. Its founder was William C. Velasquez, and other Mexican-American political activists joined him. On August 6, 1975, so 10 years after the Voting Rights Act of 65, President Gerald Ford amended the act to also end discrimination against so-called language minorities, protecting the voting rights of Latinx, as well as non-English speaking Asian Americans and other immigrants from other nations speaking other languages, made it possible to translate registration materials into languages other than English, and it strengthened the political power of communities of color. But there's still one more group who faced barriers. Oops. Lower turnout among people with disabilities was a result of barriers to the ballot box. Imagine using a wheelchair or a walker and not being able to get into the polling place because there is no ramp, or the door is too narrow, or too hard to open, or lacked automatic openers, or the pathway to the voting area was obstructed and lacked proper signage. Imagine if you were blind and you encountered a voting machine that didn't offer audio or large print ballots. Well, several federal laws now protect voting access for individuals with disabilities. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 provides a national mandate for eliminating discrimination against individuals with disabilities. The Help America Vote Act of 2002 specifically provides that an accessible voting system must provide individuals with disabilities the same opportunity to vote privately and independently that others enjoy today. And then I'm going to flip through. So voter suppression still occurs, and there is a script that goes along with this and talks about some of the things that are happening today that are keeping people from being able to vote. We then talk about how state laws are changing, but that you still need to keep an eye on things because there is always going to be pushback. And so you need to read what pushes in the other direction. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, so that was a lot. Tell me your thoughts. Ask me questions. Let's see what we can do to. Oh, and Barbara, that video that you sent me, the music, I loved it. It was just, Barbara had, I will share that with the rest of you. I've written to the person who recorded it and asked for permission to link it to the last slide in our presentation, because this man wrote a piece of music that just is our slideshow. It would be a great way to summarize what goes on. Anyway, I'm stopping to talk. Tell me what, ask me questions, talk with one another.
I have a quick question. I have to drop early. So is it possible to get a recording of this meeting?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions?
I have a question. Was
Yes,
this
Julie.
timeline presentation designed to fit how much classroom time?
Initially it was 40 minutes, and it can be done in 40 minutes, but
Okay.
it's a stretch. You
Yeah.
have to you have to decide sometimes which slides you're going to include and which you're not. If I need to leave something out, I tend to leave out the current voter suppression efforts and just make the point that they do exist and you still need to fight against it. Instead of, we have a slide on the John Lewis the Voting Rights Act, the two things that were just, not voted on. And there's a description, as I said, of some of the things like of the Native American tribe in, I think it was South Dakota, where the laws were changed just prior to the registration deadline, saying that people needed to have street addresses in order to register to vote and vote. And the tribal elders went around and created street addresses because they didn't have them. They had post office boxes.
Right, right.
We also have a story about a young Latino in New Mexico, I believe it was. The town decided that they were going to change the polling place. There had been one polling place in the center of town, which was accessible to everyone who lived in the town. And the town decided to move it to a new location 2 miles away from the center of town where there was no public transportation that made it accessible. And this 18-year-old young man fought it and won. He got the polling place moved back into the middle of his town. We also talk about like voter IDs, the fact that young students in Tennessee, for example, have to have Tennessee driver's licenses if they want to vote there, and they don't make that real clear. And so some of the kids wind up not being able to vote. So there are stories like that that you can use. I saw a hand up and now I don't see it again. Oh, Diana, thank you.
I was wondering if you could go over when you do inspire some of those students, how do you connect in the moment so you can talk to them later?
Generally, we connect with the teacher and we ask the teacher to do that for us. It is very confusing at the end when we try to do a pre and a post assessment with classes at this point because we want to see the impact that the lesson is having in the hopes of winning some grant funds and that sort of thing, and we need that. But the teachers that we've worked with have been very cooperative and will say, who was that young lady in the right-hand corner? Please put us in touch with her. That's better than trying to talk to the students themselves immediately, because at high school level, at any rate, because you're dealing with privacy issues. You can't ask them for information without their parents' permission. And so the teacher is the better avenue. Judy?
Is there an evaluation form that goes along with this?
Yes. Like I said, there's a pre and a post. It basically asks the kids, how much do you know about these different groups? And then at the end, it asks them the same question. And it also asks them beforehand, how likely are you to vote in a presidential election, in a governor's election, in an off year, and in a local election, like a school board election? And what we've learned so far is that most kids have some intention to vote in a presidential election. That didn't change too much from before the lesson to after the lesson. But prior to doing the lesson, we found that most kids were not going to vote in a gubernatorial or a local board of education or a state assembly or whatever. And at the end of the lesson, their intention to vote in those elections was equal to their intention to vote in presidential elections. Now, whether or not that turns into actual voting behavior, we don't know. and we want to find out, but that is also going to take a grant to have a university set up the study, because you need to have what's called an IRB number. You can't do research on human subjects without it being judged to be not harmful to those students. So we need to get some money to get a university. We have a university interested in doing that, but we don't have the money yet. So other questions? I think that pre and post is on the website too. I'll have to double check that. I'm glad that you asked that. Because we were using it for our own purposes. I'm not sure it's there.
It will be interesting given how school board elections have become so politicized and book banning and critical race theory and the whole 9 yards, how students might be starting to perceive them as not boring, that this is really critical for their own futures.
We actually had two college students run for boards of election in their own towns in this past election, which I think is pretty remarkable. They didn't win, but they ran and they learned, and they will run again. So that's also positive. Okay, any other questions about that? Okay. If there are, you can come back. All right, the second piece of that is a piece that we developed once we decided we were going to go into high schools. Oh, I better check and see if I have done that. Yeah. I will get this right yet. I think that's it. Back to the website. All right, so the truth about turnout, we determined that high school students should have to deal with some data too, that it wasn't just enough to tell them a story. They needed to actually work to understand better what voting power is really like and what power they have in order to make a change. So the truth about turnout is the second one on the page, educators and community groups. And you click on the module. And again, you have a couple of folders. The slideshow and the script is here, and we'll get back to that. But this excuses for not voting is something that we use at the end of the slideshow. The game directions, there are a couple of, there are extra excuses and so forth, but there are the directions there. But these excuses cards are similar to the avatar cards. I asked Staples to print them for me, and one side gets the excuse, and on the other side there is one reasonable response to that particular excuse. So in this set of slides available from the website, you have 85 different or 40 different excuses, I'm sorry, and possible answers to those. That's more than enough for most classes. If I am working with a group, larger group, like sometimes you're like maybe 4 or 5 classes are together, I have the kids work in pairs so that they each have one that they can use for the game that we do. But again, I have them printed and laminated at Staples. The 40 of them, I think, was about $90. If you don't want them laminated, it's going to be less than half of that. So keep that in mind when you're working on this lesson. You can also print them yourself, but I don't have the kind of a printer. I have a black and white printer still, so I can't do it myself. All right, so we're going to go back to the module. And there is a script for this as well, but we're going to go through the slideshow. Okay, so you would think, based on that first lesson, that of course everybody's going to vote. Once they get the power to vote, they're going to use that. They're going to go every single time. But that's not necessarily the case. What I'd like you to do is to write down on a slip of paper, and very often I will give kids a sheet protector with a piece of white paper inside and a marker and a tissue. And I say, I'm going to ask you to write some things down, but you're going to have to do the erasing for me so they don't wind up making all kinds of fancy designs around the whole thing, which it takes me half an hour to erase. So, but on this piece of paper, I'd like you to write down the percentage of people who were eligible to vote that actually voted in the last presidential election nationwide. All right, so just for yourselves, do it for yourself. Write down the percentage that you think actually voted out of those who were eligible to vote in the presidential election. Wait a minute. And then I will go around and say, all right, first I'll say, how many of you said more than 50%? How many said less than 50%? And then I'll narrow that down until I get somewhere between 60 and 70%. And if I've got 3 or 4 kids, I have pens that say energizing young voters on them, and I give them out as prizes for having come the closest to the correct answer. Once they see this, I say, all right, there is still that whole 1/3 of the population that didn't turn out to vote. And it wasn't always that good. In 2018, at the midterm election, it was only 50% of the population that voted. And that was a lot for a midterm election. And elections matter. Oh, this is the slide I talked about before. And I will go back and I will ask them first, what are some of the things that you care about? And they will pretty much give me the same things that you'll see on this slide. And then I'll use this as a review and say, many of the things people care about are immigration, the environment, guns, taxes, war, healthcare, education. And then there are others. There was an other. And one of the ones that comes up all the time now is abortion. So you can see those are all single words, and they really do have positions on both sides. So that's one of the things where we try to stay issue agnostic. And when people, like sometimes the kids, when they give their own what they're passionate about themselves, they will tend to lean in one direction or the other, and you can hear it. And then I, as the teacher, will make a point, but there is another side to that. And the other side is, if I know it, what it may be that somebody else thinks about. This slide I sometimes hide, but what I use this for is to make sure that the kids in the group understand how to read a graph and some of the things that can trip them up on a graph. So I'll ask them first, what are some of the things, and you can actually unmute yourself and answer this question. What are some of the things that you notice about that graph? What can you tell for sure by looking at that? Before you answer me, what I want you to notice is that this is voter turnout rates, and it's almost 100 years of results. So if you look at the title, you'll learn some things. If you look up and down the axis, the vertical axis, you'll see this graph doesn't start at 0 and go up to 100. What that does is make things look more exaggerated. So keep that in mind when you're looking at the graph. And then if you look across the years that are at the bottom, you'll notice that there are 6-year spreads, not 4. And we usually think about elections in terms of 4-year cycles. So think about what that might do to the graph and what you're actually looking at when you view that graph. It shows presidential elections, and the key shows that there are also midterm elections. So what is something that you notice about that? You can answer me if you want.
The two graphs roughly echo each other, but about 20% apart.
Right, it's about volume.
Yeah, that's one of the first things that the kids will say too. Anything else that you notice?
War.
What about war?
Well, the years that we were at war, it was extraordinarily low.
It's interesting, yeah.
Anything else that you notice?
That the 2020 election was higher, turnout was higher than anything on the graph.
Oh, okay. That's an assumption because you can't actually read that on the graph. And that's great that you said that, because that is exactly what I want to have happen with the kids. I want them to say something that you can't tell from looking at that. so that I can make the distinction for them between the data, what you can actually see, and then assumptions that you can make. Very, very reasonable assumptions in many cases, but you want to make sure that they understand the difference. And when we're doing it remotely, we actually have them take a sticky note, move it to the board, and write something that they believe, and then put it in the column where it belongs, facts or assumptions.
I'm sorry, I don't understand, Pat, why that's an assumption. We had found it was 66%, correct?
Yes, but it's not on the graph. This goes up to 2018.
Correct, but the graph stops at 65, so it's not really an assumption, it's just applying additional data that we had from the previous slide.
Okay, yes, you're right, but that is not something that you can tell from this particular graph if you're only looking at this one.
Correct.
So,
I see. Okay.
Yeah, and really that's okay. Diana, did you have something you wanted to add?
I just had a question. Since the election results are going to be certified this week, do you have people that are going to update this graph so we can see the really interesting 22?
There are two ways we get our graph. This particular infogram came from a resource that you really need to know about. Tufts University has a group called CIRCLE, CIRCLE, all in caps. They take and analyze youth voter turnout in every way, shape, or form that you can imagine. They also offer wonderful webinars. So if you're interested in youth voter turnout, that is the place to go for updated information. The other place that we turn to for all of the graphs that you'll see from now on is the US Census Bureau. And that has led us to some really kind of sticky situations, but it is information that is used across the country regarding voting. So that's what we decided that we would use here. All right, so once we've gone through that, so let's go back and talk about who has the power of the vote. And we're talking about today. Let's look at a group of slides. All right, now if you look at these, you'll see that they go from 0 to 100%. And you look at the years across the bottom, and you'll see that it is probably the years that most of you have been alive when you're talking to high school and college kids. And this particular line shows voter turnout by age of eligible voters who are 18 to 24 years of age. I'm going to show you how this graph builds. This shows people 25 to 44 years old, the percentage of them that turn out to vote. This shows people from 45 to 64 years of age. And this shows the percentage of people 65 and older. Now, what I want you to do for yourself is to write down something that you know for sure by looking at these graphs. And then write down one assumption that you could make based on what you see here. And please really do this for yourself so you have the experience. Okay, and then we're going to go on to some others. What we just did was the stop and jot. We're going to look at how voter turnout varies by race and ethnicity. Again, 0 to 100 and 2000 to 2020. Yes.
Can you remove your control bar because it's covering up a lot of data on our screen? You know, the lower that bar there. Yeah, you have to.
How do you do that?
Vanish. You do. I think the escape bar will do it. Hitting escape. If you click on it, there is a way to minimize it. Or if nothing else, drag it somewhere else because it's blocking even more.
All right.
Just as an FYI, when you're doing it with students as well remotely, it blocks all your dates.
All right. Is that better?
No. Yeah, but now it's on somewhere else.
Now it's on the top, right?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Don't worry about it right now. We'll worry about it later.
Okay.
Yeah, the top is better because there's the data's down below.
Okay, and I'm just going to go right up over presidential turnout because you know what it is by race and ethnicity. So this is non-Hispanic whites. This line represents non-Hispanic blacks.
Oh.
And we say non-Hispanic whites and blacks because that's what the Census Bureau uses. They consider Hispanic an ethnicity, not a race. This is the line that represents Hispanic voters. And this is the line that represents Asian voters. So now do the same thing for yourself. Write down something you know for sure by looking at this data, or what the data says for sure. We don't know it for sure because we know about data. And then what is one very reasonable assumption that you can make by looking at that? And then we're going to do the same thing with level of education. This line, and if you notice on the left-hand side, this graph does not go from 0 to 100. This one goes from 30 on up, and I will need to change that, but it's something I do point out to the kids. Right, so this line represents people with less than a high school education. This line represents high school, people who have a high school diploma, but nothing beyond that. This line represents those who have some college or a college degree, a bachelor's degree. And this line represents those people who have a postgraduate degree. So again, write down something you can know for sure by looking at that data, and then something that is a reasonable assumption. Okay, and then I'm going to stop sharing it again. What I'd like you to do now is to talk with one another, and I'm going to try very hard not to jump in because I do tend to do that. Talk with one another about what you noticed about the information that was presented in those graphs. If we were in a regular classroom, I would put you in breakout rooms, or I would break you into small groups if I were in person, so that there'd be 4 or 5 people, but I think we're a small enough group to do it ourselves. So what's something?
If you were doing that, would you have those graphs still up there for reference?
Yes, yes. So what did you notice?
Well,
Michelle?
voters 65 and older, I guess, are the most consistent voters of any group. That was really a flat line.
And 65 and older and post-grad are both voting at approximately an 80% eligible.
I noticed that blacks their vote seems to be suppressed since the Obama election. Their turnout for voting has turned down, and I would see only one reason for that is voter suppression. That's my assumption.
That's your assumption. That's fine. And that's
could also be voter enthusiasm or suppression. We don't really know, but it's clear it's gone down.
That's right. It's clear it went up in 2008 and 2012. If you go back to those graphs yourself, you'll see that those 2 years, I mean, it just skyrocketed and then it went back down. Now, the assumptions that you make based on that are all reasonable. Diana, do you have your hand raised, or do you want to just jump in?
I have to go, but I have one question before I do. Thank you so much. This has been excellent. In terms of what are you trying to achieve with the breakout groups? Are you trying to achieve just conversation or consensus, or What is the purpose behind that?
That's a good question. It's conversation. What we're doing is setting the stage for them so that, because the next slide says, so historically what it means is that people who are older, the older you are, the whiter you are, and the more education you have, the more likely you are to be a voter. And that goes right back to those people that we saw in the beginning of the timeline of suffrage. Those are the people who are making the decision today.
Okay.
And that's why you see so many old white men in Washington, although that's changing. I have to be fair about it. That is changing. And then we say, give them some data that says, and now the important thing for you to know is that you are, as of this upcoming election, the largest voting bloc. And if you get out to vote, you are going to have the power. So,
okay.
So that's the purpose.
Do they understand that these voting blocks get pandered to by politicians because they'll talk to the biggest voting bloc to get the votes?
They will, and they will likely start doing that with young voters because they're seeing how many new young voters
Yeah,
there
let's
are.
hope it. Yeah.
Diana, I don't think you finished your question.
And then the thing that I noticed was Asian and Hispanic voting increased about the same 20% over the course of the graph. Hispanic slightly less, and I have no assumptions about that. I just noticed that it was the very similar track.
It was, and
So,
that's when I said there were some anomalies by using the census data. That's one of the things that happened up until this last census. There were 5 different groups. It wasn't not just Asian. There were 5 different groups into which Asians were broken down. It included Alaskan Natives, Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, South Asians, I'm just trying to think. People of biracial people were a separate group, and now all of those have been lumped into the other categories. So the Asian line changed because it was conflated.
okay, thank you. Bye-bye,
You're
everybody.
welcome. Thank you for coming. I hope we hear from you again, Diana. Be in touch. Okay, so any other comments about what you noticed from the graphs and what assumptions you were making, Yvonne?
Well, I thought your last graph showed an increase in voter participation in all groups. An uptick in voter participation. And the assumption I make is the polarization that has been happening in the whole political environment has really energized people to go out and speak up a little bit more.
Because of the polarization. Good. So that's an assumption, and it's a reasonable assumption that you can make. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to get the kids to know the difference between those two things. And all of our lessons kind of intertwine. One of the reasons we do that is because in our Across the Divide lessons, we can refer back to that if they have already had that experience and say, people are making assumptions based on exactly the same thing. Where are you getting your information and what helps you make your assumption the way you do? Okay. Oh, yes, go ahead.
I was just going to say, maybe down the line to say, if you're not white, not highly educated, not male, you outnumber those people who are. If you are non-white and young, you make up this huge demographic. You can tip the scales.
Exactly.
Because you have the numbers behind you.
That's exactly what the point is that we're going to try to make to them during the course of this. And that they get, when we ask them at the end of this lesson, we ask them to finish some sentence stems. I used to think, and now I think. So how has your thinking changed because you participated in this piece? And it's really interesting with some of them. Some of the comments are on the website underneath testimonials, I think it's called. I think that's the tab. But let me go back now to this and show you. So This is when they get together. So who is now making the decisions? It turns out that historically, the older you are, the whiter you are, and the more education you have, the more likely it is that you will vote and make the decisions that affect all of us. So voter turnout turns out to be a really big deal. And if you want politicians to make the decisions about those issues that you talked about way, earlier today, if you want them to make the decisions that you want them to make, you have to get involved. You have to elect people who reflect your values. So, is there change ahead? Well, maybe. Looks that way. Young people made their voices heard in this last election, but even more so in the previous election. In 2018, 31% of young people turned out to vote in a midterm election. That was enormous.
Wow.
Votes cast by young people made up 12% of all the votes. And that is also remarkable. What I like about this is that those people who live in battleground states, the young people turned out at a higher rate than across the rest of the country. But even 27% in a midterm is an enormous increase. So you are the people who are most likely to influence others your age to vote. How do you do that? We need you. We need you to help people register for the next election. Every day, early voting happens. You need to be encouraging your friends and your relatives to get out to vote if they haven't. You need to remind them that they can vote by mail, no excuses. And I know you people in Washington, you're all vote by mail, so that wouldn't apply to you. You'd have to change that slide. And then you can remind them of election day. But you can also say things. Say things and they work. And I'll show you a slide that explains some of those. This is based on psychology. Everybody wants to fit in. So you can say things that make it the norm. You can say, it's really important to me that everybody who's eligible registers and votes. Will you join me at the polls and make your voice heard? And this one I love. There's a very subtle difference between having a person do something one time or calling them something that means that it's part of their identity. So you can tell people to vote, but if you say you're a voter, aren't you? You're helping to create the identity of a lifelong voter in that person. Making a plan, we know, is a very important part of getting people out to vote. So we can address their commitment issues. We can ask them, what time are you going to the polls? How are you going to get there? Do you need a ride? Can I help you? And then you can follow up, because nobody likes to let a friend down. So a kid might say, I'll text you on election day to see how voting went for the first time. So those are some of the things that kids can do. They can help other kids who want to fit in. They can create an identity, they can address commitment issues, and then they can follow up. So why don't some people vote? Well, there are lots and lots of excuses. These are just some of them. And what I'm going to do now is go back to that excuses game and show you how this works. Oh, I know what I need to do. I think it's not letting me do that. All right. At any rate, with those excuses, we distribute one card per person as long as we have them. So they have an excuse on one side and they have that reasonable answer, one reasonable answer on the other side. So we tell them, okay, read your excuse and get your answer into your head. Give them a minute to do that in the class. And then we say, all right, we're going to play a game. So I've got my excuse and I am going to read my excuse and I'm going to pick somebody to tell me what the answer to that should be. So I'm going to pretend, I have to work. I can't get to the polls on election day. And then I'm going to say, Julie, what would be the answer that you would give me to that?
The answer would be, who could you carpool with? Could you make a plan to ask someone to go to the polls with them, or somebody in your family or friends that might be voting?
Can anybody add to that?
Vote by mail.
Okay.
Oh, right, you have vote by mail. That's right.
Anybody add to that? Okay. And then what I would do, oh, I'm sorry, Marietta?
Oh, just early voting.
Okay, good. So all of those things are good answers to what the excuse was. And then the person who has the card, if I've got something on the back of my card that adds even more to that response, then I'm responsible for telling you what that is. Okay. And then since I put Julie on the spot, Julie gets to do the same thing. So she gets to read her excuse aloud. And I always make them read it aloud first before calling on anybody. So everybody needs to think about what the answer might be because they know she's going to pick somebody that she wants to put on the spot too. So I wish I could get back to those so that we could see them more easily and let you pick one. You want to make up an excuse somebody might give, Julie?
My vote is not going to count anyway, or you had something to that effect. It really doesn't matter.
Okay, and that's one that we hear a lot. So you get to put somebody else on the spot now.
Okay, how about Barbara?
Well, you're guaranteeing it doesn't matter if you don't vote. The only way it doesn't matter is when you don't vote. Then it will be nullified. Anytime you vote, it's going to matter. It can be that one tipping point that puts your party or your candidate over the edge. You just never know.
Okay, and then Julie, you ask if there's anybody who can add to that.
Oh, can anybody add to that? Okay, well, I guess I saw Yvonne's hand go up first.
I guess so. I said, well, in the recent elections, there were some municipalities where the person that won by less than 10 votes. So every single vote does count.
And Carol, did you have another one?
Well, there was in the last election in Virginia, there was a representative where there were equal numbers and they ended up having to have a coin toss to who
That's
won.
right. That's right.
Would have made the difference.
Okay, so I don't remember who you put on the spot first, Julie.
Barbara.
Okay, Barbara, you get to make up an excuse.
I don't know anything about the issues. I don't even know what a ballot is. I've got 3 kids at home and I'm just too busy. I don't know what's going on.
Put somebody on the spot.
Gwen.
I'd say if some of the things that have already been said about reasons not to vote apply here. Certainly if you vote by mail or if you were to do early voting, those are ways to address that issue. Is there anyone that can help you with that? Do you need a ride? Do you want to go with me on the day that I go?
Anybody add to that, Barbara?
I would vote that, I would add that Vote 411 database by the League of Women Voter is a great place to start because it has a list of and depending on whether candidates responded to our invitation or not, you can learn a lot about candidates there. But you can at least learn what's on the ballot. You can learn about where your polling location is.
Okay.
And I would volunteer to come and babysit.
Yeah, really.
I would also add that you don't have to vote for everything that's on the ballot. If you just vote for the president, that ballot will be counted. And when you're beginning to vote for the first time, it gets overwhelming to see a ballot and all the choices that you have.
It does. And that's one of the reasons with our voting simulation that we do give kids a sample ballot so we can help them walk through and learn what a public question is, as well as, you know, the information that's on there. Now, you can see this kind of a game is fun to end the thing with, and you can expand it or you can contract it depending on how much time you have left in the class. The other thing I do is I often give the teacher a list of all of the questions and excuses, especially in high school and college. Sometimes there are 2 minutes at the end of a class where you're done with what you were going to teach that day and the bell doesn't ring yet. And so you can ask one of those questions and have the kids give a response. So that kind of engages the teacher as well in the process of helping kids understand that it really is important to vote, and all of those excuses go right out the window when it comes down to the wire. The comment that you made about voting for president, sometimes we'll get the kids, well, why should I vote at all? Because this is a blue state or this is a red state.
Oh,
and
yeah.
my vote's not going to count. And the answer, one of the answers that we often hear from them is, well, that's only in the presidential election. In any other election, every single vote counts, like the election in Georgia right now. You know, it's not the electoral college that is making that decision. It is the individuals. And so it is important to vote in all elections, because even in a presidential election, you are voting for more than just the president. So get out there and vote. So
when I was doing doorbelling over in the red part of our state, I learned something from an invisible woman that I was, and she got this excuse. I have 3 kids, I don't know. And she said, is there an issue that affects you specifically? Like what early childhood education? I mean, she would narrow it down to their frame of reference and said,
that's good.
This is an issue that touches you.
Yeah.
And I know you're staying away from issues, but that's can get the person more engaged, I think.
Yeah, I should clarify, we're not staying away from issues. We're staying away from putting our slant on an issue. We want the kids to identify their own issues, and we want the kids to develop their own position on those issues. But it's not our job to tell them what that should be. So in the Fighting for Change lessons, you'll see that they are encouraged to establish their position on their issue. And I'll tell you that sometimes it is not my my issue or my position, particularly my position, but it's my job to help them learn how to use the democratic processes in order for them to make the future what they think it should be, not what I'm going to think it should be or live in. So that's the I'm glad that you brought that up, because there is that distinction there that I want to make sure we make.
So I have a question about that.
Sure.
Because one of the things that it seems to me is an issue with voting in this country right now, regardless of where you stand on any issue, is that when you vote for issues that are meaningful to you based on a particular stance, you aren't necessarily voting for the larger good. And how do you encourage young students to be thinking about their votes as meaningful to the whole, not just themselves? And is that even something that should even be thought about under these circumstances? Perhaps we're just working on engaging with voting. The rest comes later. As you get older, you can see all the old people show up to vote because they've had a lot of time to think about things. And when you're young, you're just like, this is what I think, I'm going to show up and vote. And that's good. But I do think that in this country right now, we are seeing a disconnect. It's issue voting versus voting for the common good. And I'm curious if there's anything that you guys want to say about that, maybe as a group.
I don't know if this is exactly to your point, but one of the things I try to express with actually voters of any age is that politics is kind of a long game. The fact that you voted today on something doesn't mean that's going to be accomplished tomorrow. And I think that's why there's a lot of frustration with voting. And particularly maybe for young people, they care about the environment, but one vote, And so I don't know if other people have other ideas on that, but I do try to talk to people about the long game.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Because but you can be surprised too, like for many of us in a negative sense. Okay, this probably is too partisan, but an example, I did get permission to use this in high school. I don't know if this was right, but conservative elements put in a long game to get certain judges on the Supreme Court, right? They've been working on this for decades and decades. And then overnight, this new ruling on abortion came out. So that happened really quick.
Right.
But the game, there was a long game that preceded that. So there might be some better examples, but you kind of have to be alert. What can I say? You have to realize that, your efforts are going to have to continue.
Yeah.
Any other comments?
And the older people who are voting right now in huge numbers are not going to be here to be living on the earth in 20 or 30 years.
Amen to that.
The teens we're talking to and their children. And if they don't vote their interests will not be reflected in.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a point that we make over and over again in this lesson, but in others too.
I don't know if this is in your curriculum, but trying to make it real that the things like one class I was in, most of the kids didn't realize they were paying taxes because they were thinking of income taxes, right? But they actually are paying taxes every day, when they buy stuff and buy gas, and we have toll bridge. And so trying to be more, and plus those are local issues or state. So
when it comes to voting for the greater good, we don't have anything specific about that. But the vote by design lesson, which I'm not going to talk about tonight or walk through tonight, but you can look at it on the website, is designed to help people think more carefully about how they make their voting decisions. It focuses on helping them identify leadership qualities that they personally value. And we walk them through the process, and they've got, forms they can fill out and all that kind of stuff. And then they do that individually. And then we put them in a group of 6 or more people where they have to come up with a composite of the leadership qualities that they can all live with, and they can only have 6 of them. So they aren't allowed, actually it's less than that. They have to narrow it down so that there are 3 or 4 qualities that they all agree are important in a leader. And the idea behind that is that you're never going to have your perfect leader, that you're going to have to be willing to make some adjustments in your view so that you pick the person who's closest to what you personally believe. And the other part of that is that we have kids identify issues, the issues again, that are truly likely to face an elected official during their term of office. So whether that be the president or a governor or your school board person, there are real things that that person is going to be facing. And then we have the kids pick one of those issues. We have 4 set up, but if the kids come up with something that's really interesting, we use what they have. All right, here's the issue. I should back up a little bit. I'll finish this and then I'll go back. Here's the issue. You've got your perfect leader now in this description that you've come up with. You have 5 minutes to write the beginning of a press conference that will tell the people in your state, your town, that you've got this, that you can manage this crisis, that you are going to keep them safe and protected. And then put them to work on writing that. And they have 5 minutes to do it in a group. It's really interesting. The other thing we have them do is once they have that perfect leader in mind, their personal perfect leader, we show them 4 video clips, 2 from the 2016 presidential primaries and 2 from the 2020. So 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And we say, okay, given what you think are the leadership qualities that you value, which one of these 4 people would you pick? And I will tell you, when I did this the first time, I picked somebody that I did not vote for. It was really an eye-opener for me. And then I just presented this lesson to a group of AAUW members. So these are older women, well-educated women, lifelong voters. And I said at the end, I used to think, but now I think. And several of them said, I am going to pay much less attention to debates, to family members, to friends, because now I know what I value. And I go, wow, for somebody my age to be saying that is important. And you're going to see if kids are doing it, they're going to do it on a less sophisticated level than that, but they still get it. Right. And they are less likely to just vote the way their parents vote, which is what most of them do now.
Right. Wow.
So, all right. Any other questions about either the timeline of suffrage or this? Who's got?
I have a technical question. You mentioned, is it Tufts University?
Yes.
Analyzes youth turnout?
Yes.
You mentioned a particular program there that we should go to?
It's called CIRCLE, CIRCLE.
CIRCLE. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. The other thing, just teaching tips. When I'm in classes in person, I very often have, I carry a backpack. I have markers. I have, these sheet protectors. I have little prizes that I can pass out, little goodies, at the end that I can give as tokens of us having been there to remind them of what they've gone through. I use sticky notes a lot because you can give kids a sticky note and say, what's your issue? And they write it down and they come up and they stick it on the board, anything to get them engaged and moving and active. But those of you who are teachers know those kinds of tricks. Just for those who aren't, if you want to know more about that, I'm more than happy to talk another time. I want to take about 15 minutes just to show you, I hope, the last piece that we're going to talk about today. And for some reason, there we go. All right. Back to the website. And now, did I lose you?
Nope.
There you are. Okay. Okay, so we're going to take a look at module 4, and there are 2 parts to that. One of it is, again, a very short module that is called the Rules of the Road, or there's one that we modified a little for community groups called the Nuts and Bolts of Voting. We just had, because of the census, we had redistricting, and there were some things that we added there for a local community group. But the voting simulation is the thing that I love. It is somewhat complex, but it's doable because there is an actual guideline for you, or guidebook for you. Tells you what the kids are going to be able to do, lays out the materials that you need, says what the school needs to do, what you need to do, how you prepare for it, how many months ahead you need to do this, how many weeks ahead, and so on. So it is really very detailed. It is all focused on New Jersey, though. So those of you from Oregon and Washington, please look at it and make any changes. We have in-person voting with voting machines in New Jersey. And so this is one of those experiences that gives kids a chance to go through something before they actually have to do it on their own. One of the things that we know about young voters is that many of them don't vote because they don't want to be embarrassed. They don't want to do it the wrong way. They don't want to make mistakes on who they vote for. All kinds of things that have to do with feeling insecure about the process. So the voting simulation tries to take care of that. What we do, and I'm going to stop sharing this again and go back to you. What we do prior.
Pat, you haven't been sharing with us.
Yeah, I didn't see anything.
Hang on.
We're not seeing your screen.
Hang on, I'll do this again. Okay, so this is again from the website directly. I'll show you that too. So it's on the same page that all of the other modules are. It's the last one. It's called the voting simulation. And this is where the module is. And it lays, like I said, it lays out all the details. This is what the kids should get out of it. Tells you the materials, what the school needs to supply. What do you do? 4 months ahead, 3 months ahead, 2 weeks ahead, and so on. And we go out 2 to 3 months because we have in-person voting and we have to arrange for the voting machine. And that is what takes the longest amount of time. Now I am missing there. So what we do is, once we have been connected with a school for a while and we've presented a number of our lessons on the voting side, we offer the voting simulation. It's not just bringing a voting machine to school. It's not just filling out a ballot. It's the whole experience. We either run a voter registration drive before this, or we ask the teachers to actually provide voter registration forms to the students in the school who are going to be doing this. If they're really eligible to register, we ask them to collect those and to get them into the County Board of Elections. If they're not, it's just a practice session, and they can do it online in New Jersey now, which is nice because you don't have to have a whole bunch of paper forms too. I do urge teachers to use the paper forms for the kids who are eligible to vote to make sure that the signature is clear and acceptable, but they don't have to. So they have the experience of filling out the voter registration form. We ask the teachers then to give us a list of all of the students who will be participating in this in alphabetical order by class, because when we set this up, usually it's several classes and they will come down one at a time. And we'll use that to set up a poll book. We've done it the old-fashioned way with real books that people have to come in and sign into. We don't yet have the ability to use the tablets, which we are currently using in New Jersey, but it's the experience of signing in that's important. It's not the actual material or the concrete item. So we've got the registration forms. In some cases, we have worked with the school, and the school has developed its own ballot based on issues in that school district. And that includes a public question or two. And we provide some things that are league-based, like one of the public questions is, should the voting age be lowered to 16 or 17 or something like that? So the kids get a sample ballot with a public question on it, with a choice on it, and then also with the example of like a voting district and the information about when the actual election is, all of the things that you would normally find on a sample ballot. And either we come in and do it, or the teacher does it and explains what that is to the kids. It is the same ballot that they will see when they go into the machine. We come the day of election day when the machine is there. The kids come down class by class, and we've taken their alphabetized list and put those kids' names into a mock poll book. It looks just like the ones that used to be used in the county here. We ask the teacher ahead of time to give us the names of some students who will not be traumatized if they're singled out during the experience of voting. And if they want to, they can actually tell the student that they're going to be singled out. It's not as long as the kid keeps it secret, because otherwise it ruins the surprise element. On the day the kids come down, they go up to the table. They are supposed to sign in the way they normally would, but one of the students has been picked out as having voted by mail. So when that kid comes up to the table, we tell them they can't vote because they already voted. And if they haven't been told ahead of time, there's this confused look on their face, and we stop everything so that everybody in the room has the chance to stop and listen. And we say, this kid voted by mail and now he wants to vote again. What should he do? And the first time it happens, it's like, I have no clue. So we talk about provisional ballots and how you ask for one and what happens to it. And so the lesson is taught the first time. The second person is somebody who's left off the list. And especially if somebody wasn't there on the date that they had to fill out the registration forms, we try to have one of those kids' names left off. And we say, all right, you're not registered. Your name isn't in the book here. And the kid said, but it is, I did register. And we stop the presses again. What should this person do? Ask for a provisional ballot. Usually one person will say that. By the time you get to it the third time, the kids are saying, you ask for a provisional ballot. So the message has gotten through to them that there are things that you can do. And we also give them a phone number that they can call if they are challenged, so that they know that there's help available to them. Then they go into the voting booth and they get to vote the way anybody else would, because we're not going to keep them from that experience either, because we want them to know how the voting machine actually works. And then at the end of that, they go back to their classroom. At the end of the day, we announce who the winners were. There used to be a piece that I have not included now because of what's gone on in this election, where we had the teacher talk about, we live in a country where the majority rules. And so what happens when your candidate wins, and what happens when your candidate loses? And I have just stayed away from that after this election, because it's just too sensitive an issue for a teacher to have to bring up in a classroom. But maybe someday we'll get back to the point where we can do that and help kids understand what the process should be, or was at one time. So at any rate, it is a very, very extensive process, but it is so worthwhile. It is just unbelievable what the kids will say back to you, like, I'll vote. Now I'll vote. I'm not going to be afraid to do it. And to me, that's worth every hour that it takes to prepare for that. So
what age groups are you using that for? Just high school and close to voting age?
Those are the groups that we've done it with, are high school groups.
Mhm.
In New Jersey, and I think in Washington, there's a law, I think you told me the other day, in New Jersey, there is a law that the school districts must provide voter registration and voter information to every student who will be eligible to vote in the elections, which means that you have an ideal opportunity in New Jersey to get in and do voter registration before the registration deadline for elections. But a lot of school districts don't realize that that is the law, even though the superintendent is supposed to sign off on it. But if they know that you know, it makes a difference. So I wouldn't be afraid to say, I know that you're aware that you have to have this information distributed to your students. So we'd be more than happy as the league to come in and help you with that. So at any rate, so questions about the voter simulation? Okay. If they come up,
I don't have a question. I just have a comment because we're all mail-in voting in Washington.
Yes.
One of the simulations we'll have to do is show young people how to go to the mailbox.
Yeah, I know that. Do you have
because they don't pick up their mail. They pay their bills on their cell phone. They do everything on their cell phone, and they don't pick up their mail. So that's one of our simulations. I just want to share that.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And that would be true in other states that have different laws and routines too. You want to make the simulation really follow exactly what the kids are going to have to do.
And when they ask for a mail-in ballot, they need to know they need to go to their mailbox and get
it. Can they pick it up? Like, that's so funny. Yeah, there are a lot of kids who don't know how to buy stamps too. I know that it just blows my mind because it's so foreign to me, but it's really true.
Well, in Washington State, they don't have to put a stamp on their ballot. They can just drop it in a drop box or drop it in the mailbox without a stamp on it.
Yeah,
that was because a lot of people don't know what a stamp is, but we're still working with the mailbox routine, the simulation.
Okay, so
have you run this program with middle schoolers?
Yes. Everything.
The first two modules seem okay, but
we've done all of them with middle schools. Every time we have developed a lesson, we've piloted it. We've piloted it at middle school, at high school, and at college. And then we make any adaptations that we think are necessary. So when you go to the website, if you look at the Fighting for Change modules, you'll see that there is a middle school / high school version or a high school / college version. And then you can, and any one of those, when you know your audience, adapt it for that audience. I have found the biggest difference between the middle school and the high school version of I Am the Change is that in middle school, we found we needed to teach them how to write a letter. In high school, we give them the task of either writing a letter to a state or a federal official or writing a phone script that they can use when they call, or writing the beginning of the 5-minute public speaking section of a Board of Education meeting or a municipal council meeting. We don't have to teach them the nuts and bolts of actually writing the formal letter. So, yes, they're all adaptable. And they're fun. Everyone is different, and I'll tell you, I have gotten to the point where I think my favorite group are community college students. They are passionate about what they're doing. They work so hard. And many of them are, really counting their pennies to make sure that they can get there and go through the tuition. So I love working with those kids. It's amazing. So, all right. So, when we're finished, not today, tomorrow I will send out the recording of tonight. I will send out a summary of the things that we talked about tonight so that you'll have that as well. And I'm going to add you, as long as you want to, I'm going to add you to something called Sign Up, which is the way we get people interested in making presentations with us. Now, for those of you at a great distance, it would mean that you'd be signing up to observe first in a classroom where something is being, one of these lessons is being taught. Anybody who decides to be a presenter with us, and there's no obligation to do that based on being here, but if you decide you want to be a presenter, we ask that you observe first and then co-present with somebody. And that can either be a hybrid presentation so that you're watching, we set up a computer so that you can watch what goes on in the classroom. I'm not real good at that, but usually the teachers are. So that's good. And then we encourage you, when you make a presentation on your own in person, that you do it with a partner, because we have found that it really helps to have people bouncing off one another. One person will remember something that another one doesn't. And there has been the occasion when somebody went into a coughing fit and had to leave, which would have been horrible if there was only one person in the classroom. So partnership is really good. I would also strongly urge you to get kids involved in the presentation. Teachers know who leaders are in the classrooms. And I ask them ahead of time, is there somebody that you think would like to work with us and actually do a part of this? And most often we get a yes. And we get permission from the parent to work with the kid remotely. And then from that point, when we go into the classroom, we work with the kid who is doing part of the presentation, and they have the script and they read their section, and the kids in the class will perk up as soon as that young person's voice is there. It's just remarkable. I love it. And there have been times when I thought I was going to do part of the presentation, but we had maybe 3 kids in the class who were interested. And so I said, you do it and I'll be there. I will be there to back you up, but you take charge. And they do. And they're wonderful. They get this. They really get this, and they're passionate about it. The video clips that you saw, those are just 2 out of the kids. We're trying to get the slide about the Spanish language shift done by a young person of Hispanic heritage. We want to try to find someone with an indigenous background. We're looking for somebody of an Asian background to do the same kind of thing that Amira did for the Black women. If you have people in your community who can do that, by all means. If you have kids in the classes that you know, or in your league that you know, who might want to make those, substitute what we have. Put one of their faces in your slideshow. It's going to be more effective. So be creative. We have training dates 3 times a year. This one we do Fighting for the Vote because in January and February and March, with the Black History Month and Women's History Month and what's the other one? Anyway, the request for these lessons is greater than at other times in the year. So it's a good place to start. In March, we have a training session for the Fighting for Change lessons. Not the across the divide, not the communications piece, but what's your issue and I am the change, those 2 things. And that's going to be March 13th. It's a Monday again. If you want to have somebody walk you through using the Student Advocate Toolkit, which we developed during COVID because we couldn't educate people in public places. So we got the kids to serve as advocate. We taught them how to register people by mail. We taught them how to vote by mail, and then made them go home and work with their communities, or from home, work with their family members or their household members or their pods, whatever they were with. So that's available. It has been modified for 13 out of the 21 counties in New Jersey. If yours isn't available on the website, there is a template where you can create one for your county, but most of them are very similar, and all the directions are there, just exactly what you need to change and what you need to look for. So it's a simple thing, but if you want somebody to walk you through it, I'm happy to do that. There's also a template for other states. You're going to have to do a lot more research because there are too many states for me to do a lot of the research, but it does tell you what you need to look at and what you need to make sure is accurate for your state. The August is the time when we spend a week. There's a training week, and we do every single one of the lessons, walk people through them, and then help you actually do them yourself. That's the first week in August every year. So think early in the month. And that's it from me. What can I do for you?
Well, I guess in the back of my mind is how difficult it is to get into schools unless you've gotten into them and have a connection going. I mean, if you have any tips on that.
I do. Think the number one. You only need to get into one classroom or into one community group or into one student activity, which means that you really only need one contact. And most of us have somebody that we know in the schools who knows somebody, like a friend of mine is, well, she's now the social studies supervisor, but she was a teacher, and she put me in touch with one other person, and it has grown from there in that particular school district. The other thing I'd suggest you consider if you're doing something statewide or countywide is to try to target the communities that are typically underrepresented, because I think they need what we're offering more than other places do. And that's just my personal preference. Let me see if I can find it again. On the website, there is a section for leagues. And I still have that bar up there. I hate that. So here's the website. If you go up to the League of Women Voters, so under what we do, learn how to energize young voters. I should make that brighter. Click here to get started. And there are the steps to starting you up. It's actually a checklist. And again, the emphasis is on doing just one thing and doing it well. And then it will grow from there. Is that helpful, or do you have other questions?
No, that's helpful. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Anything else?
I think if we don't have that many questions, it's because your slides and your scripts are so informed that it leaves little for us to wonder about. So much.
You've done a great job, just a great job.
Well,
intimidating it is. It's just intimidating.
Please don't let it be intimidating. That's why I keep saying use the number one. Keep that in your head. You don't have to do it all. We started with one lesson. I don't think I told you this, but it was a friend of mine it was a bring your grandmother to school day. And we were supposed to do something when we got there. So she, as the league president in my league, said, I'm going to teach a lesson about voting. I said, great. And I sat there, and at the end of it, I went, I learned so much from the lesson that you taught to fifth graders. You can't keep this to yourself. And so that's when we started using the timeline of suffrage in one high school class, because I had this friend. And she said, that's really good. And then Peggy and I said, but we need to do more, because we knew for high school students, it was a good start, but it didn't put it in their laps. It was a story. It was a motivating story, but it didn't make them understand their power and the importance of them taking the action. And so that's when the second lesson was developed. And then COVID hit, and then teachers started saying, well, could you do this? And could you do that? You know? And so it really just grew. And I have said to the people that know me and know what we are doing and have been doing, that there's been something bigger that's been directing this. It has not, it's the right thing at the right time. And what we're doing is responding, not trying to push something. So the fact that people need this should give you some encouragement to try and say, you know, just let me try it once. see what you think of it.
I particularly like the experiential components that it's all formed around, because I know enough about how people learn best. They have to experience it. They have to talk about it. And this is built around experiential components. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Well, it has been a pleasure for me. Go ahead.
I just wanted to reiterate, I think what you were saying, Pat, was that you're not expecting us to head out there and do it alone the first time. You've offered, and other people who are doing it are looking for the assistants or the co-teachers or the observers. So at least in my thought, once you start sending out hey, I need somebody to assist somebody on this one, that's how I would.
Right. And that's what you will
the water and get up to the ankle and then to the knee.
That's right. And some people have jumped right in, and that's fine. That's, you know, they're often, you know, previously been school teachers or whatever, and they're very comfortable doing it, and they do a great job. So whatever works for you individually is what works for us.
So, Pat, have you, this might be barking up the wrong tree, but have you tried, does the Board of Education or having an entry in the Board of Education help in any way getting the programs in?
Sometimes. I would not want to start at the Board of Education unless I knew somebody on the board, an individual. I wouldn't go to the board and say, I think you should adopt all of these lessons, because you're going to get pushback, especially in today's world.
Yeah.
So, but if you go in the back door, you'll be much more likely to be successful. Well, thank you all very, very much. I really appreciate the time and the interest and the involvement that you showed tonight. And let me know if you need any help.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Yeah, you too.
And bye-bye.